Morning, journeyers. This is Rick, your pastor. This morning we are going to be talking about power over and power with. And you know what it feels like to have your power taken from you by somebody or some system, some pattern, some entire way of life that maintains power by taking away other people's power. Bullies do that. Governments do that. Dictators do that. All kinds of influences in our lives do that. And if you have ever felt bullied, taken advantage of, demeaned, dehumanized, then you know what power over feels like when it's used against you. It also probably reminds you of what it's felt like when you have used your power over someone else or some other situation. Jesus' model of power was power with, to be collaborative with the situation, with the person or people, and with God's Spirit. Jesus sees everything in terms of collaborative, cooperative action and discernment with God in the center. I believe that's what Journey is about. I believe that's the only way to make the world and our country healthier and more whole in this season that we're in. So this morning, I am super happy that we are spending time with some wise teachers like Brene and a Work of the People video and some other influences that can help us focus on, in the midst of fear, in the midst of terror, in the midst of wildfires and pandemics and job stuff and teaching stuff and life stuff, to focus on a way of understanding fear and how to deal with fear from a perspective of power that's available, especially when we are collaborative and we are in community. Our preacher today is not me. It is our latest candidate, pilgrim, for ordination in our faith community, Christina Wisdom. And I am so happy that she's going to be preaching today. And I am happy that we all get to hear the wisdom, get it, that she's going to share about power. She's going to talk about Franciscanism and St. Francis. She's going to talk about Mark chapter 5. It's going to be a day when we are encouraged to use our power in ways that are meaningful and loving and healthy and humble to make the world better and ourselves healthier with God's Spirit. So in that spirit, I want you to take a breath. Take another. When have you used your power in ways that were freeing and loving and healing? When have you shown up, even in the midst of fear, your own or someone else's, and been a voice of calm and creativity and community? That's what God is like. So God, be with us in the next hour and help us to be open, to be healed, and to give healing to others in the midst of our fear and uncertainty. Amen. What do we want love to be?
I think we confuse it with happy. I think we confuse it with pleasure. I think we confuse it with short-term gratification. But it's just not. I mean, it's like you and I have talked about parenting before. I want my kids to like me. sometimes, and I want them to think I'm cool. And I want them to look at me with those adoring eyes and be super happy about something that I just said or did. But that's not love. That's not my job. I mean, they look at me with those eyes a lot and they're grateful and happy for a lot of things, but sometimes I have to make really tough decisions that don't feel good for them in the moment and don't feel good for me either. But that's love.
So love is saying, like, you're a sinner and you will go to hell unless you do this, and I'm saying this because I love you, not to be mean, but Jesus is holding you over like a fire, like a spider. And no, that's not it?
No. Love and shame are mutually exclusive. Love and threatening are mutually exclusive. You don't have to, you don't have to threaten someone or shame someone or intimidate or harass someone. You don't have to exercise power over people to love them. In fact, I don't think you can exercise power. You can exercise power with people, which was Jesus, power with people, but not power over. I think we don't like the word power because we automatically conflate it with power over. But there's also power with and power among people. And so I think church has become power over when Jesus was power with. And not all church, and some churches are trying really hard. But like I always think about, here's the thing that I always think is weird. You look at Jesus as the greatest teacher, right? About love. All of his lessons were about love. All his parables were about love. And so you have Jesus as the most important teacher in our story, in the Christian story, about love, right?
And gay people. You talked a lot about that.
Shut up.
Okay, sorry.
So you have Jesus as this great teacher of love. And he's naked or he's in robes or sandals and he's teaching us and he's living love and he's sharing power with. And he's not respectful at all of power over. And then you have churches that are created that are all power over. And you have priests and pastors and rectors in these vestments that are like, and you got naked Jesus, the best teacher, and then these like completely armored, worse than the military uniforms, completely armored clergy. And so we just have moved away. We've moved away from love and power with.
Hi, my name is Dan and I'm a journeyer. This is a reading from the Jesus story called Mark, chapter 5. After Jesus came back from across the lake, a large crowd quickly found him. He stayed at the shore with the crowd of people. One of the leaders of the synagogue of the city, Jairus, came in the middle of all the people and fell down at Jesus' feet. He begged, "Please, my daughter is dying. She's only 12 years old. Please come to my house. If you will just place your hands on her, I know she will live." And Jesus began walking with Jairus to the man's house. The whole crowd followed, pressing around Jesus. In the crowd, hiding, was a woman who had continued ongoing bleeding for 12 years. This made her ritually unclean and an outcast. She had suffered terribly, and although she had spent all of her money on medical care, she had only gotten worse. She heard of this miracle worker Jesus, and she had decided, even if all I can do is touch his clothes, I know I will be healed. So she snuck up behind him through the crowd of people and reached out her hand and touched his cloak. As soon as her fingers brushed his cloak, she felt immediately that her body was well.
Hello, I am Alteza and I am a journeyer. Lots of people were pressed against Jesus, but he immediately felt her touch. He felt power flow out of him. He stopped. The crowd stopped. Jesus looked around. He said, "Who just touched my robe?" His students said, "The crowd is so thick, everyone is touching you. What do you mean?" Jesus stood there waiting. His gaze swept across the crowd to see who had accessed his power. And then the woman, knowing he was talking about her, pushed forward and dropped to her knees. She was shaking with fear and amazement. "I touched you," she said. Then she told him the reason why. She told him her whole story. And Jesus said, "Daughter, you are well because you dared to trust God. Go in peace and may you stay well."
It's not a different kind of a song because you look so different.
No, I was going to do that and then I decided I wouldn't.
No.
Change my mind.
All right, you're just going to do your own thing. Very good. Or anything at all, Sinead. That would be nice.
Make me a channel of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me bring love. Where there is injury or pardon, Lord. And where there's doubt, true faith in you. Make me a channel of your peace. Where there's despair in life, let me bring hope. Where there is darkness, let me bring light. And where there's sadness, ever joy. O Master, grant that I may never seek so much to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, or to be loved as to love with all my soul. Make me a channel of your peace. It is in pardoning that we are pardoned. It is in giving to all men that we receive, and in dying that we are born to eternal life.
Why did you sing that?
Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of reasons.
Like what? Give me three.
Well, Ireland is one, and Jonathan Ball is another, and the two children who killed the little boy are another. My own personal life, of course, is another. Well, blah blah, all kinds of things. Human beings.
But it was beautifully done.
Thank you.
Really beautifully done. Beautifully done. I'd never heard it sung before. I've heard it said before, I've never heard it someone before, there's a girl crying in the audience, look. Because of you. Okay, we can't follow that. No way of following that, Don. We better leave it. Okay, thank you for joining us. Good night until next week. God bless you. Good night.
Good morning. This morning we are going to talk about power, and more specifically the ideas of power over versus power with. So I think we live in a power over world, and if we were together in the Journey Lighthouse, I would open discussion and I would ask everyone to share what they think that means. Since we're not together, I'm going to tell you what I think it means. I've been giving this a little bit of thought, just based on like a 30-minute nightly news segment, and what I've observed about our power over culture. So it's an election season, so we've got a lot of politics happening, a lot of jockeying for position and power on every level of government. Sadly, it has become routine to see news reports about undefended Black men and women killed by police officers in what are supposed to be routine traffic stops. In response to that, we see nationwide protests, and we see reports on those, and battles between peaceful protesters and violent protesters, and police officers that just want to show up and just bear witness versus the National Guard being sent into some places to institute some level of control. It looks like the earth is literally groaning with wildfires and hurricanes and a global pandemic, climate change in response to our attempts to manage and exploit her. COVID, the races for the vaccine, the debates over mask use, what businesses can open, which businesses can close, what schools are open. It's an ongoing battle between territory. Over and over again, I hear regular citizens saying on the news, regular citizens just like you and me, being interviewed and saying something along the lines of, the people in charge want me to do X, but I don't want to because I have a right to do Y. And it struck me watching this that in a power over system, we think we have to defend our territory all the time in some form or fashion. We can't handle anyone telling us how we're supposed to live our lives, how we're supposed to be uncomfortable, how we're supposed to do something different, even if it's for the greater good. And so what do we get for that? Like, what is really happening in our culture right now? I just was thinking about the hard things I see on the news. Children living in cages on our borders. Peaceful protesters getting shot. At this point this morning, I heard almost 200,000 Americans alone dying of COVID. Black men and women continuing to die at the hands of law enforcement. In our own city, there are hundreds of people living under the overpasses. What this tells me is that our power struggles are not working. They may appear to be working for a few, but I think that's temporary. And I think as long as we depend on a power over system that's rooted in fear, which is the opposite of love, as long as the status quo continues to stay propped up for the benefit of a few at the expense of many, we are failing at this thing called being human. As followers of Jesus, we are called to be power with people in the midst of a power over world. Journey endeavors to be a power with community, and there are other models of that type of living as well. One that comes to mind is one that I recently learned about called the Franciscan Way. So this is, I participated in a Richard Rohr study. Richard Rohr, as so many people know, he runs the Center for Action and Contemplation. out of New Mexico, and he's a Franciscan monk. And so there was this 7-week course over the Franciscan way. It's helpful to know a little bit about the story of St. Francis before we dive into what modern day Franciscanism looks like as a religion and as a way of life. So just a little bit about him. He was born in late 12th century Assisi. He was the son of a wealthy cloth merchant. He was generally known to be a good businessman, very jovial, outgoing, popular, generous. I think most people sort of considered him that guy who was the life of the party. He seemed to be on a constant quest for something more. He was not satisfied with the easy life that he was born into. And so for him, that was his quest was, I want to go to battle. I want to be a famous knight. And so he went to war. And he was taken prisoner and held captive for about a year before his father paid a ransom for his release. Still, he wanted more glory, so he rode off into another battle. During his pursuit of prestige, he had a dream where God asked him, "Who would you rather serve, the master or the servant?" And Francis replied, "Well, the master." And he heard God say back to him, "Then what are you doing serving the servant?" Put another way, what are you doing serving yourself? Go back to Assisi and you will find what you should do. For Francis, this dream was somewhat of a revelation. Soon after he encountered his greatest fear in the form of a leper, Francis had lived such a privileged life. He was not used to being around people who were unclean or sick or diseased in any way. And he actually had a real phobia against sickness. But he was riding his horse and he came across this man who was a leper. And very uncharacteristically, he came down off of his horse. He embraced this diseased man and he gave him money. And in overcoming his own revulsion of sickness, his heart began to change. Something that until that point had been a horror to him now became something he sought. He changed from being a pleasure seeker to someone who was looking for something entirely different. So he didn't really know what to do. He just began wandering churches, looking for God in places he hadn't looked for God before. Eventually, for Francis, he ended up moving away from his family. He gave away all of his money and his possessions, even his clothes, and became known as sort of a wandering holy man, endeavoring to live the life of Jesus. So from St. Francis's life and Claire, who was the woman who was with him, we have Franciscanism today. So Franciscanism ideology can be summed up in 3 words: love, humility, and poverty. According to the Franciscan worldview, God is literally in everything. Every person, every animal, every rock, every tree, every speck of dirt. God is literally in everything. Therefore, everything and everyone belongs at all times. So the Franciscan way, really at its core, calls its followers to give up being right and defending their territory, whatever that is. And I think we all have different territory that we defend in our lives. The Franciscans learned from St. Francis's way of life that from a place of powerlessness, there's less to defend and protect. So there's more open heart space and room to love and to serve other people. Like Jesus, Francis was very drawn to suffering, and he identified with the weak of the world, not the powerful. Because Francis literally went from being one of the most powerful people in his community. He was male, he was wealthy, he lived in Upper Assisi, to being one of the most powerless in his community. He was literally living with poor people in a leper colony. He was able to identify with God at the bottom of the power struggle. That's where he found God. And this enabled him to see that God is patient and forgiving and always on our side. Another thing I think that Francis really paid attention to was this idea of the status quo. And that whenever we are defending the status quo, we are unable to question power. And Francis never forgot that power is what crucified Jesus. So the Jesus story we read for today, I think, is a really perfect model for being a power with person in the midst of a power over culture. So let's look at the story. So it says that Jesus came back from across the lake, and one of the leaders of the synagogue, Jairus, came in the middle of the people and fell down at Jesus' feet. Jairus' daughter was sick. He desperately wanted Jesus to come and heal his daughter. So, of course, Jesus said, okay, let's go. We're going to walk to your house. The whole crowd followed. There were tons of people around Jesus. By this point, he was known around Galilee and Capernaum. People definitely knew who he was, and people were definitely seeking his power. So the whole crowd followed, and in the crowd hiding was a woman who had been bleeding for 12 years. This made her ritually unclean and an outcast. She suffered terribly and had spent all of her money on medical care, but it had only gotten worse. But she believed that if she just touched Jesus' cloak, she could be healed. And the story says that she snuck up through the crowd of people, touched his cloak, and as soon as her fingers brushed his cloak, she immediately felt that her body was well. Okay, so let's unpack that piece of the story before we move on to the second piece. In the first century Jewish social world, the politics of the day was completely based on purity. And this goes back hundreds of years to laws in Leviticus that said, you shall be holy for the Lord your God is holy. And holiness came to mean for the Israelite people over time separation from everything that is unclean. And so also over time, it became understood as holiness ended up meaning the same thing as purity. So it was understood, you Israel shall be pure as God is pure. So basically what ended up happening socially is we have these stark polarities of clean, unclean, pure, impure, which basically created this purity map, which applied to anything and everyone in the community. Persons, places, things, times, social group. In the world where this story was taking place, one's purity status determined everything about their way of life. So in this story, Jairus was absolutely considered the most pure. He was male, and he was a leader in the synagogue. So then we have the crowd, right, who's following Jesus. Presumably, I think that I'm sure there were all levels of purity in the system within that crowd, but I think because most of the people, were out in public and mingling, and I think we have to assume on some level that they were considered ritually clean. The woman, though, the bleeding woman, she was absolutely considered the lowest of the low. She was considered to be untouchable because she was chronically ill and bleeding. She was a woman, so that's also another thing. And she was poor. The story says that she spent all that she had and still was not well. So back then, to keep the purity laws, if you were poor, it was actually very difficult to keep the purity laws. They were designed really, sadly, the priests and the people who ran the synagogue would actually make a profit over people adhering to the purity laws. So if you were poor, you had a really hard time doing that. So she was just about as far down on the list as anyone could be. Okay, so let's go back to the story. It says lots of people were pressed against Jesus, but he immediately felt her touch. He felt power flow out of him, and he stopped, and he said, "Who touched my robe?" And of course, his disciples are like, "Man, are you kidding me? There are like 200 people here. Everyone is touching you. What are you talking about?" And he said, No. His gaze swept across the crowd. The story says, to see who had accessed his power. And then the woman, knowing he was talking about her, pushed forward and dropped to her knees. She was shaking with fear and amazement, and she confessed that she was the one who did it. And she told him her whole story. Jesus said, "Daughter, you are well because you dared to trust God. Go in peace, and you may stay well." Okay, so here we are. Jesus moving through this crowd where the politics of the day was purity. But for Jesus, I mean, we know even though he was raised to be a good Jewish boy and was absolutely taught those politics, he followed something different. I mean, for him, he was so attuned with God, and he just related so much to and was so drawn to and believed so much in the compassion of God. So compassion, not purity, was Jesus's politics. So the story says that Jesus immediately felt her touch and felt the power go out of him, and he stopped and called her forward. So we've discussed other times and other discussions about all the reasons that he might have called her forward to bring about her own healing. But let's actually focus today on a different message that Jesus was sending about sharing power as he called her forward, and really the huge political statement he was making. So she was clearly scared to come forward. That's what the story says. She knew she wasn't even supposed to be there. But it was important for Jesus to call her forward so he could show the people that even though he was on his way to heal the daughter of a very powerful man, this lowly woman was also worth his power and his healing. By calling her forward, he was actually restoring her, not punishing her for busting through the purity system to access his power, but he was acknowledging her. He was telling the crowd, yes, I know I'm on my way to heal the daughter of this powerful man, but this woman is worth saving. This woman is worth saving. You know, now that I think about it, I realize we probably should have also read the rest of that story, because it's actually pretty powerful for this discussion. It turns out that Jesus, after he heals the woman, he continues on with Jairus to his home to heal his daughter. And when he arrives at their home, everyone thinks it's too late. He's gone there too late because she's died. But it wasn't too late for Jesus. He was still able to heal her and bring her back to life. And the thing to me that really strikes me when I read this story through the lens of power is that in the moment, the story says that when the bleeding woman touched him, he felt all the power go out of him. But she didn't use up all of his power. By the time Jesus reached Jairus' home, God had given him more power to do more healing that day. That's the thing about God. As followers of Jesus in the kingdom of God, we are co-creators. We are co-leaders of power. God gives us power and we get to decide how to use it. And in the kingdom of God, we are always called to be power with people in the midst of a power over world. I cannot think of one exception to that rule. Sadly, though, we are conditioned from an early age to operate and succeed in a power over world. To move from a place of power over to power with takes a lot of attention, and it takes a lot of intention. It requires answering the call to lay down that which we feel we must defend and see each other as living mirrors of God. That is what every single one of us is, no matter our gender, our skin color, our socioeconomic status, our educational proficiency, our religious affiliation, our political affiliation. We are all the light of God. This requires us to move through the world and seek out suffering. Like Jesus, we are called to let the power drain right out of us as we compassionately pour ourselves into the healing and restoration of each other, trusting that there is no end to the power we will have access to if that's how we choose to use it. So as we leave this gathering this morning, I encourage you to take a moment and think about how you're using the power you've been given. What groups are you a part of? Are those groups more interested in power over or power with? What would happen if we each saw everyone and everything around us as brilliant lights of God? What would there be left to defend if we saw our brothers and sisters in the world also as our co-creators, our co-leaders with God? What would there be left to defend? What would happen if we let go of all we think we need to defend to keep our own territory and to keep our own power in place? I think there's an invitation in this story for each of us here, and it's to use our power for the benefit of others, to use our power for the flourishing of all creation, and to use our power to break the yokes of oppression. I pray we would all, myself included, walk into that invitation this week.
In Louisville, at the corner of 4th and Walnut, at the center of the shopping district, I was suddenly overwhelmed with the realization that I loved all these people, that they were mine and I theirs, that we could not be alien to one another, even though we were total strangers. It was like waking from a dream of separateness, of spurious self-isolation in a special world. This sense of liberation from an illusory difference was such a relief and such a joy to me that I almost laughed out loud. I have the immense joy of being man, a member of a race in which God Himself became incarnate, as if the sorrows and stupidities of the human condition could overwhelm me now that I realize what we all are. And if only everybody could realize this, but it cannot be explained. There is no way of telling people that they are all walking around shining like the sun. Then it was as if I suddenly saw the secret beauty of their hearts, the depths of their hearts, where neither sin nor desire nor self-knowledge can reach the core of the reality, the person that each one is in God's eyes. If only they could all see themselves as they really are. If only we could see each other that way all the time. There would be no more war, no more hatred, no more cruelty, no more greed. But this cannot be seen, only believed and understood by a peculiar gift